I believe we need a civil rights agenda for our time, one that ensures the rights to a great education, so important, and the right to live in safety and in peace, and to have a really, really great job.
Donald Trump reaching out to black voters at an African-American church in inner-city Detroit yesterday. And it's time now for our Sunday group. Fox News senior political analyst Brit Hume, Neera Tanden, president of the liberal think tank, the Center for American Progress, and Gearan of the Washington Post, and syndicated columnist George Will. Brit, first of all, welcome back.
Thank you.
What do you think of Trump's visit to Detroit and that black church yesterday? And what do you think of his outline, in very broad strokes, of an an agenda for civil rights?
Well, I think it was probably worth a try. But I sense that he will probably get more credit with white voters for making the effort than he will from voters in the inner city, whose resistance to appeals from Republicans going back decades has been remarkably strong. So I doubt he'll make any inroads of any consequence in that particular segment of the electorate. But nonetheless, you had people looking to find a way that they could possibly support him. We'll see this soft-spoken version of Donald Trump making what I think are some detailed and serious-sounding, at least, proposals, and that might do him some good, but probably not within that community.
Neera, if Trump weren't talking about these issues, you'd criticize him. Are you going to criticize him for talking about these issues?
I think the fact that he's at 0% of support in some swing states of African Americans is heretofore well-deserved of his policies. I actually think the fact that you pointed out that these policies he stated yesterday are not on his website, and his history. I mean, I think the reality here is that most African Americans have come to know him from his attacks on the first African American president, his birtherism, but also his history. The New York Times has a long, detailed story last week about Trump Industries and a history of housing discrimination that goes back 30 years. So I think there's a long record here, and 2 months before the election, having never gone to a black church or even engaged in discussions with black audiences, I think people see this as a transparent attempt to kind of make up something where he's far behind. He's far behind McCain's numbers, Romney's numbers with African-American voters, which weren't strong, but he's still far behind them.
George?
You say 2 months before the election. We're 19 days before the voting starts in some states. And Mr. Trump is saying essentially, never mind what I've said so far, I'm going to change. He campaigned for 400 days after announcing his candidacy, and then said, I've got some regrets. He didn't say what they were, but he said, I've got some regrets. He goes to the black church, reiterates standard Republican views, school choice and all the rest. But people are supposed to forget he's a birther, or at least he was. He's the one who said he'd sent, 5 years ago, I've sent investigators to Hawaii to investigate the president's birth, and people are going to be amazed by what they found. He hasn't told us, but again, they're supposed to forget that. He goes to Mexico and says, the people I've described as rapists are actually now exemplary Americans. Then he goes to Phoenix, and he chooses to be introduced by Joe Arpaio, the sheriff of Maricopa County, who's the very face of hostility to immigrants. I don't think it'll work. Obviously, the Hispanic vote, like all American votes, isn't quite monolithic. But still, what should worry Republicans most of all is that in 2012, Mitt Romney did even worse among Asian Americans than he did among Hispanics, which indicates that minorities generally do not feel welcome in the Republican Party.
Brit, are you as resistant to his outreach to minority voters as Brother Will here?
Well, there is a contrast, obviously, between this soft-spoken man speaking in that church yesterday and the bombastic Trump of days before when we heard so much of, which suggests to me that the impression that African-American voters and other minority voters as well may have of him, it may be sitting in cement, which is why all the things George cites, I think, are part of the reason why I think he'll have trouble rallying much support, if any, in the community, where, as Neera pointed out, he stands in some states at 0.
Yeah, that's bad. All right, let's turn to the issue of Hispanics, because Trump also tried to make an outreach this week to the Hispanic community. A couple of weeks of talking about softening his position on mass deportations. Then, as we see in the middle of the week, he went on Wednesday to Mexico City, met and had a very respectful press conference afterwards with Mexican President Peña Nieto, sounding a diplomatic note. But later that same day in Phoenix, he said this.
Day one, my first hour in office, those people are gone. You can call it deported if you want. The press doesn't like that term. You can call it whatever the hell you want. They're gone.
And Trump was talking there specifically about illegal immigrants who commit further crimes, not just coming across the border illegally, but further crimes once they get in. But despite that specific point, for all of this back and forth over the last 2 weeks about was he going to soften, was he going to harden, did it do him any good with Hispanic voters?
Well, probably not a great deal. I mean, you see the dueling efforts here of Kellyanne Conway and a group of other Trump advisors who are pulling him in opposite directions on what he should be doing to at least give a credible sense of outreach and openness to Hispanic voters. She's a pollster, she's a demographer. She sees the ultimate imperative of his having to have an outreach to Hispanic voters, and for Republicans to have an outreach to Hispanic voters past this election, whatever happens to it. She's doing making some effort to have him make that outreach. I think what you're left with here is you can pick which Trump you like from 5 hours apart, right? They were different people saying different things, and Hispanic voters are going to look at both of those images and certainly more likely see that what he said in Phoenix as the real Donald Trump.
But I want to pick up on this with you, George. And let me begin, first of all, with this question, because we asked you for questions for the panel, and we got this on Twitter from Ron, who tweets, "Voters have their minds made up, especially the African-American voters." So, George, let me ask you, first of all, how do you answer Ron? But also, what about this point that you heard from Ben Carson, that you hear from Donald Trump? Look, you've had decades of Democratic government in America's inner cities. They're the bosses in most of the elected officials in most American inner cities, and things have not gotten better in a lot of places. And as we pointed out in some statistics, they've actually gotten worse.
It's indisputably true what Ben Carson says. The blue model of government, so-called, the alliance of the Democratic Party and the public employees unions, particularly the teachers unions standing athwart school choice, has not served the African community well, African-American community that's in the cities. That said, there's no reason to believe that the standard Republican appeal, school choice, welfare reform, all the rest, that Jack Kemp brought to American politics, he ran as the running mate of Bob Dole, had no effect so far as I can tell. And I don't see it having any effect this time around.
All right, we have to take a break here, but we'll see you panel a little later.